Hello and welcome to a special interview for VIT today. We have with us the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian. So it's a pleasure to have you on the show, and we hope we can have a fruitful discussion. So starting off the interview, in our research, we saw a few months back when an interview you gave, you spoke about drawing a parallel between the Spanish flu and the COVID crisis. Could you perhaps clarify why that relative was drawn, especially with an epidemic a century back? And from a fiscal and an economic sense, would you be able to draw that same parallel between the what happened in 1927, the Great Depression, and what's happening today in our economy? Would you be able to draw that same relative?
Thanks a lot, Satak, and a very warm wishes to all the viewers and the students. So you are basically asking me to draw a parallel to two crises: one a health crisis, and the other the economic crisis. And as it turns out, the economic crisis that we are having is essentially linked to the health crisis. And so I think that's a good question to start off with. First, on the health crisis, you guys are all wannabe doctors, and doctors who are or people who are students who are getting ready to become doctors. So this must be something that but for a pandemic, epidemiologists use this parameter called the R naught parameter, which essentially captures the number of persons that infected person himself is likely to infect. And the R naught parameter for the Spanish flu was about 2.4. Research has now shown that for the COVID, the R naught parameter is about 2.3. So it's very similar. Just to contrast, the common flu that comes every year, especially in the Western economies, has an R naught parameter of about 1.3. On the other side of the spectrum, the pandemics like Ebola or smallpox have an R naught of about 3.5, touching 4. So if you take the spectrum of how infectious the pandemic is, then the Spanish flu is very close to the COVID. And that's why, from a health perspective, it is actually a good parallel to draw. This is just based on the data. If you look at from in other measures, no other pandemic, be it SARS or be it Ebola, none of the other pandemics in the last 100 years have been as intense as COVID. And therefore, we have to go back in time 102 years to the Spanish flu to try and compare the pandemic of the scale that COVID is. Yet it is, I think, important also to keep a few other facts in mind. If you take the Spanish flu episode, in the Spanish flu, almost 1/3 of the global population was infected. 1/3 of the global population. In contrast, even today, with the large number of cases across the world, we still are not even at half a percentage point. So 1/3, which is about 33%, versus about less than half a percent. So orders of magnitude lower in terms of how infectious the COVID pandemic has been vis-a-vis the Spanish flu. The other important fact is the recovery rate. The mortality rates in the case of the Spanish flu was of the order of about 10%, while in the case of the COVID, it's about 3.5% globally, which is clearly shows that it's about 1/3 of what it was in the case of the Spanish flu. In other words, the rate of infection was about 100 times higher in the case of the Spanish flu, and the rate of mortality was about 3 times greater just globally. So in that sense, even though we've not had a pandemic of this size in the last 100 years, this pandemic is far less intense than the Spanish flu, and that's why the comparison is very important based on facts. Now let me come to the comparison on the economy. I think there are, I would like to compare not only with the global, financial crisis that happened in 2008, 2009, the Great Recession that happened, but in general, periods of great uncertainty like World War One or World War Two, because there are important similarities and differences, in that comparison. So first thing that happens, when it's a warlike situation or the Great Recession or the, or the Great Depression, is that there is a lot of uncertainty. And that uncertainty is what affects people. There's an important distinction which I'm going to come to in a little later. But what is critical here is that from an economic perspective, if you think about the two core ideas of supply and demand, when you look at demand, what happens in periods of uncertainty is that demand comes down significantly. Why? Because most people will try and actually not spend money. They would want to save. They would want to keep money, with them for a rainy day if they actually have to take care of healthcare expenditures. And therefore, most people indulge in what we economists, term the precautionary motive to save. That gives jargon, economic jargon for saying, as a precaution, people want to save. Then, as a result, what happens then? That if you take consumption and split it into the part that is, essential consumption and the part that is discretionary consumption, so discretionary consumption gets really affected because people say, this is not necessary for me. I do not need to spend this. Instead, whatever money I would have spent on that discretionary spending, let me save it because I may need it for, for healthcare expenditures. So demand for discretionary items, and especially durable items, tourism, restaurants, all these definitely gets impacted significantly in any period of uncertainty. This is common across periods of uncertainty, be it the global, financial crisis, the Great Recession, the Great Depression, or war periods. So that's what happens on the demand side. One key difference is that the uncertainty that we are talking about in each of these other episodes, be it the global financial crisis or the Great Recession, or periods of war, those were primarily economic in some sense. The war, I would say, not economic, but in the global financial crisis and the Great Recession, the uncertainty is all economic. It's not coming from a pandemic, a health pandemic. Why is this important? Because in statistics we have what we think about what are called first moment and second moment. The first moment is the average. The second moment is the variance or the standard deviation, which is what captures uncertainty. Now, in the case of any economic crisis, the second moment, which is your standard deviation or variance or uncertainty, is actually because of economic factors. In contrast, in the case of the COVID pandemic, the uncertainty is health induced. Why is this important? Because if it is economic, governments and, for instance, the economic actors within the government can do something to reduce that uncertainty because the origin of that uncertainty is economic. In contrast, because now the uncertainty is because of a health reason, the only thing that will bring that uncertainty down is basically a vaccine. And that's where, really bright kids like you need to be actually investing in coming up with that vaccine. So that's the key difference. In other words, governments economically cannot do very much to reduce the uncertainty. So let me again summarize what I'm saying. The uncertainty is coming from health factors. That uncertainty affects basically demand, especially for discretionary items. Because of the impact on demand, your GDP basically goes down. If it were economic, then what the government can do is to basically identify those economic factors which are responsible for the uncertainty, fix those. But because this is health induced, what we basically have to wait for the vaccine. So what governments therefore have been trying to do is to invest in the vaccine, because once the vaccine comes and people think this is any other illness, and we can take care of that like normally we would do by taking vaccines, and normal life resumes, then the economy will also be back to normalcy. So this is a very important distinction that needs to be understood. Now on the supply side, what happens, and here I will basically distinguish between a war-like scenario versus other crises, including the COVID pandemic. In this, on the supply side, actually, the fact that the uncertainty is health induced doesn't make much of a difference. But the difference between a war and a situation like this matters, because what happens in a war is that factories get bombed. Think about a factory, let's say that manufactures cars. That factory got bombed. Now, as a result, basically cars cannot be produced, so there will be an enormous shortage of cars. If, for instance, it's a factory that produces, let's say, sugar, now the factory gets bombed, there is no sugar, demand for sugar remains the same, supply shrinks, so prices will go up. There are huge supply shortages that happen in war-like situations, but that's not the case now. The reason there was some temporary impact on supply was because people basically were not coming onto factories, so hands were not there on the machines. But once the lockdown was imposed, once lockdown was taken out, then the hands came on the machines, and we've seen that the supply has come back to almost 85-90% of pre-COVID levels. That difference is primarily because of some migrant labor, and demand-related issues. So the supply side, therefore, is not as badly affected. It's only a temporary impact. In other words, once again, summarizing, demand goes down because of uncertainty, and that uncertainty is health-induced. So the uncertainty reduction actually has to wait for the vaccine to come. Supply side, the impact is temporary.
Right, sir. So as you talked about demand, which currently is on a very different term right now, the lockdown has resulted in a huge change in the consumer behavior and the spending pattern, especially. So, how do you think that we should motivate or probably encourage common man to spend on something like going out for a movie or go out for a outing or something, right? Considering the current situation.
See, Vagisha, one of the key things that economics relies on is that we all make decisions that are individually rational for us. In other words, we basically take into account the costs and benefits of a decision. So, if you take the decision of let's say going out to a mall, what you will evaluate is the probability of you getting infected by COVID. Given the probability of you getting infected by COVID, what in some monetary terms, what would be the cost of that? Okay, that's your expected cost, and the expected benefit of basically going and buying something that you wanted. So that's the way you would evaluate the cost benefit. Now, governments, what they can do is to change these costs and benefits. But as I was saying earlier, the reason that people are basically not going is because they think that the cost is enormous given the potential benefit, because that benefit might be, let's say, an hour or 2 hours of being in the mall, or maybe 3 hours for a movie. But the cost is, if I get COVID, it's possible I may have to be down for 15 days, quarantine for 2 weeks. The cost is enormous, and at worst, and God forbid it happens, it could be fatal as well. So the costs are just enormous compared to the benefits, because the benefits are maybe 3-hour benefits, or maybe 2-hour benefits, 3-hour benefit for a movie, 2-hour benefits for. So it's very hard, therefore, to compensate and basically increase these benefits, because the cost is just enormous. I think that is something all of us have to keep in mind. So the only real solution, lasting solution, is where basically vaccines come and make it like any other illness. I think this perspective of actually making sure that we think very clearly using cost benefit analysis is really critical. I'll summarize again. The benefit is a few hours, cost is days, and days of being out, and possibly, fatality as well. So the costs are just, orders of magnitude higher than the benefits, which is why all of us are taking precautions, and I hope all students are as well.
Right. So thank you so much. So quoting a few reputed economists, Dr. Rajan and Dr. Banerjee, in a nutshell, put in an interview that spend more money, put more money in the hands of the people, and that's how you'll recover from this crisis. Now, we're all engineers. We don't understand how that economics works, right? Because in a country of 1 billion, how do you just put money in the hands of the people and help and expect them to recover the economy, right? So perhaps could you explain what that means, in the sense that what do economists mean when they say that put money in the hands of the people? And do you agree with that thought process put forth by these academics?
See, in general, first thing I actually want to, encourage all students is, and I'll use a cricket parallel. Shane Warne was a very good bowler. Wasim Akram was a very good bowler, right? Today, if you take, among the Jasprit Bumrah is also a very good, very, very good bowler, excellent bowlers. But it's not as if, Shane Warne never bowled a bad delivery. And as a batsman, as somebody who actually, I played cricket, and one of the things I was taught by my coaches is to always play the ball, never the bowler. So, that's basically what I will say here, that, I will basically play the ball, not the bowler, because bowlers actually, can oftentimes be, be on just past reputation as well. As I made it very clear that the key point here is the uncertainty. Because of the uncertainty, the impact on, the precautionary motive to save, and as a result, the tendency to not go and spend on durable goods, discretionary items. I'll give you some very powerful evidence for what is happening. I'm sure all of you know about the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana. The Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana is basically, these are bank accounts that were created in 2015 for the poor people, 40 crore accounts at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, why am I picking this example? Because people who are poor, unlike people like you and me, if you earn 100 rupees, you are at the bottom of the pyramid, you are likely in normal times to just spend the entire thing. In other words, what we economists call the propensity to consume is extremely high for the poor. In other words, their propensity to save is very low. And yet, this constituent of the population, the savings among them has increased, mark my words, increased by about in excess of 20,000 crores since the lockdown started. On average, so if you take 40 crore accounts and 20,000 crores of balances, on average, each of these individuals has saved in excess of 500 rupees. As I said earlier, this is a constituent of the population that typically does not save. Why are they saving now? Because of the pandemic, because they want to actually have that money to be able to keep, sort of take care of the rainy day, that healthcare. And this is the key point. So if suppose we give cash, what will happen? It will go basically and sit in bank accounts, add to savings, because people will say, good, let me keep this cash also to take care of healthcare expenditures. It will not, I repeat, it will not actually generate demand. And that's why I said I play the ball, I do not play the bowler. Okay, and that's something, if it is a full toss, it has to be hit for a 6. If it is a short ball, it has to be hit for a 6. If it is a good length ball, obviously you play good forward defense. But so this is the key point that has to be remembered, that it is uncertainty that is leading to the precautionary motive to save, and as a result, putting cash in the hands of people will not basically just increase demand. I will also give you evidence from the United States, where in March, so the United States does not have the public distribution system, for instance, where food is given in kind to the poor people like in India. So what they did is they actually mailed checks to the poor people. And what's the evidence for how has that been spent? It has been spent on food items primarily. So in other words, even over there, the money that has gone in has been spent only on essential items, not on discretionary spending. Again, another piece of evidence to say that just giving cash is not going to actually increase demand. And I think this is where it's important, like it is to peel the layers of an onion. We have to basically go beyond the first layer and ask the question, why is it that just putting money in the hands of people will not increase savings? In fact, last point I would say, Joseph Stiglitz. Again, I'm using the ball, not the bowler. But when the bowler bowls a good ball, you have to actually take that into account. So Joseph Stiglitz actually mentioned that those countries that have done a lot of fiscal spending, he asked the question, why are they not taking into account the precautionary motive to say it's not going to actually go and perk up demand, because it's just money effectively down the drain because of the precautionary motive to save. In fact, he said that it's prudent on the part of governments to keep gunpowder dry, which is what we've in India we've done, and we have given the necessaries. For instance, we increased the cereals amount, pulses. We basically gave some money to the extreme poor people, some for the migrant workers, etc. But we basically have not just blindly thrown money anticipating that it basically will create demand, because we've actually been very careful about thinking about what will be the impact of that.
Right, sir. My next question tries to figure out a bit into the future, in the sense, even though it's unpredictable to predict anything 5 or 10 years down the line, considering status quo. But I just wanted to understand how much of an effect does what happened this year have on what perhaps the government of India had planned for the next 5 years, in the sense that at a personal level, as a student, I would probably now rethink or evaluate whether I want to enter the job market, or I perhaps want to go study more. Does status quo affect a lot of our plans for the next 5-10 years? And if so, how are we planning to get back on track?
Okay, so before I actually respond to that question, let me say something which is this is a behavioral bias that exists among all humans. If you read the book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, it's an excellent book, by the way. He talks about what is called saliency bias. What is this saliency bias? This is basically the tendency of all of us individuals to just put excessive weight on the continuation of whatever we are going through. So let me concretize that idea. So if we are in normal times, we keep thinking that the normal times will continue. We do not factor in the probability of a black swan event actually hitting. And that's what, in January, nobody factored in the possibility of this kind of event coming in. At the same time, what happens is, once we are in the black swan event, we then make the mistake of thinking that we're going to continue in that same black swan event. We will not get back to normalcy. This is what is called the saliency bias, something that all of us have to actually be very, very careful about. So my advice to you students, first thing would be to not get actually factored by saliency bias. This will also pass. In fact, yesterday you must have read about the vaccine that Russia has discovered. Yes, there are questions about whether it is actually safe, etc. But it does convey that even if they've actually not released the data of their phase 3 trials, the fact is that there are many vaccines that are very close to basically them being safe, and many of them are undergoing phase 3 trials now, and the data is actually getting published as well. So in a few months, 6 months or so, it's quite likely we will have a vaccine. And in India especially, India is effectively the factory of the world for producing vaccines. 70% of vaccines sold all over the world are manufactured here in India. So whichever country comes up with a vaccine first, India will definitely have a good shot at getting that vaccine, and the government remains committed to make it accessible to all the people. So within a few months, we will be back to normalcy. I think That is something that you all have to keep in mind. So now, what about then? So that's the preamble to your question. Now let me answer your question, which is what happens in the next 5 years. Actually, some of the reforms that have been implemented by the government, as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, are actually far reaching, and they will have important impact and a very positive impact on productivity in the Indian economy, which will thereby enable us to actually get into higher growth paths. I'll just focus on a couple of them. One is the reforms in the agriculture sector, the APMC Act, the Agriculture Produce and Marketing, APMC, I think I forget the C, APMC Act. Actually, now what it has done is actually the restrictions have been removed. So farmers can go and sell their produce wherever they want. Second, the Essential Commodities Act, which was also a big hindrance. And by the way, these were things that we had talked about in the economic survey in January, that these are all restrictions on markets, that government intervention in markets actually reduce welfare, and we made that case. So the government has enacted on it, saying that Essential Commodities Act has been diluted as well. As a result, warehousing, storage, all of that will increase. So agriculture will get a big boost. In fact, it's already starting to get a big boost. Rural incomes are starting to go up. Second thing is the change in the policy on privatization. This is a fact, and we showed it very clearly in the economic survey as well. We wrote a chapter showing how privatization, creates wealth creation. It leads to wealth creation. That private sector firms are in general far more efficient than state-owned enterprises. And now, as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, the government has announced a very, very clear policy for the private sector, saying that there'll be only a couple of 2 or 3 sectors that will be strategic sectors where there will be state-owned enterprises. In all the other areas, the government basically will get out. In other words, government will have no business being in business, and thereby enhance the efficiency of production in the Indian economy. So together, the agriculture reforms, which basically are very important from job creation perspective, because even though about, let's say, 40% of the GDP comes from the rural sector, they account for far more jobs, and therefore changes in the in reforms in agriculture will have a very big impact in terms of at the bottom of the pyramid. And second, enhancing efficiency through this policy on privatization, I think, will generate efficiency. So both of these are excellent reform measures, which will start fructifying in a few years from now. So overall, I have absolutely no doubt in saying that the future of India is very, very bright, and it's for people, kids like you, to actually take it forward.
Right, sir. So moving on towards production, the current input from industrialists show that we're currently running at an average of around 85% of production capacity, and there are companies like Maruti where the sales of these companies have been increasing pretty rapidly. So do you think that we're overanalyzing the negatives of the pandemic?
Absolutely, yes. I already responded by saying the saliency bias. See, I am an incorrigible optimist, and I do not allow myself to get affected by the widespread cynicism all around, or the pessimism all around. I have been consistently saying across the last 5-6 months that we will emerge out of this pandemic stronger, because no time like that of a crisis to actually bring in changes, which we are doing. So we will emerge stronger. Absolutely.
Right. So
I would also.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you think that there's an accelerating shift towards more tech-based and virtual-based environments, and do you see that growing more in India, especially considering the Atmanirbhar Make in India campaign, and also us adapting to a more virtual environment like we are right now? Do you see this booming much more in India in the next 10 years, and that's something that this pandemic has given birth to?
Absolutely. I think, that is certainly right. India has benefited from a huge amount of digitization of the economy. Imagine if we had not actually done implemented the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, before, we wouldn't have been able to do the cash transfers as part of the COVID package, and we wouldn't have been able to, implement, if we hadn't done the DBT technology, if we hadn't actually implemented the Aadhaar, all of that, we wouldn't have been able to reach people, during this pandemic with the necessary social distancing. So, I think digitization has enabled a lot. I recall that, and this is just in the context of technology, that my BTech thesis at IIT Kanpur was on the application of neural networks to electrical engineering problems. The reason I bring this up is, 25 years back, actually, neural networks were basically part of research, but today, not just today, about 7, 8, 10 years back, artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms have incorporated neural networks and other such things into business. And I'm, as because I remain interested in this area, I actually follow this. If you must have learned about the chess software Deep Thought, which was basically constructed through AI. And incidentally, this software was not even taught the rules of chess. It was only given the games, a huge repository of games. It learned the rules of chess by reading those games first, and then came up with its own strategy and tactics, and then ended up defeating the highest ELO rated player ever, Gary Kasparov. That is basically the power of artificial intelligence and machine learning, something that I was exposed to 25 years back. So I can see, the benefits of technology, and the fact that, we have people like you in institutions like yours, at the cutting edge of technology, who can take on the best in the world, and on technology. It's people like you who will basically create the cutting edge innovations in AI, digital technology, etc. I will specifically mark out what India needs from people like you, is essentially solutions for the bottom of the pyramid. We have a population of 135 crore people. Most of the solutions that are created by Indian companies and multinationals cater to the top 20 to 30% of the income pyramid. But there is a large section, the bottom 75%, which also actually requires a lot of products. And I'll give you the example of the FMCG sector. So if you go to any village or town, you will be able to actually get the Dove shampoo, for instance, or or hair oil, in a very small shampoo sachet, which is basically, those of us, we buy it in bottles, the poor basically buy it in sachets. That is an example of the same product or service being catered actually for the bottom of the pyramid, through it's a game, it's a volume game, not a margin game. The important distinction, I want to draw is that those companies that are focused on the top 25 to 30% of the income pyramid have just looked to play the margin game. Instead, people like you should be using technology to come up, basically to play the volume game, which is lower margins, therefore prices are lower, but reaching the real large market that we have. And that is where, the next set of big innovations come by using technology, and that will empower India by bringing products and services that basically will cater to the bottom of the pyramid.
Right, sir. So moving on to my last question, what message would you like to give the students like us who would be entering the market sector right now, looking out for jobs and internships in this situation?
So, I'll give you a shorter message, but I would encourage you to take a look at the TEDx video that I have, where I've actually talked about, how about my own learnings from life. I think the main idea I would give you is basically periods like this really build your resilience. And resilience is extremely important. To basically be successful, and more importantly, be happy in life. And I think this is something that all of you should remember, that eventually human basically values happiness, whether it's money, power, career, all those, family, all of those essentially build up to happiness. And so that's the first perspective you should keep. And in order to be happy and successful, resilience is very important. Why? Because, life is never a straight line. Life is like a sine curve where you actually have your peaks and your troughs. It's not a straight line. And that's why resilience is required to be able to actually to be able to ride the sine curve. When you are in a trough, to say that, yes, you will be back to a peak, not really get, too bothered by it. At the same time, not get too exuberant about the peak as well, because the peak will also be possibly followed by a trough. And that sense of equanimity is something that is really important, that I would actually, and that's something that I would encourage all of you youngsters to go and read, the Indian scriptures, read the Bhagavad Gita, for instance. It's a wealth of knowledge of how to live life king size, without really getting affected by stresses. That's the reality today, because we have, so much technology which has made things so much easy for us. We have a lot of time, and because we have a lot of time, the mind indulges in a lot of thinking, and that creates its stresses, etc. So I would strongly encourage you all to actually read the Bhagavad Gita, which will basically give you resilience. So that's one. Second, related to that, is not be afraid of failure, because failure is indeed the stepping stone to success. And this is, I'm not saying a cliche, something that I've actually lived in my life as well. Not just me, but everybody else. If you take any person who actually reaches some excellence in his or her profession, it basically is built by learning from failures. That's something which I would actually, and the final bit I would say is that all of you, especially at a esteemed institution like VIT, are actually very, very privileged. And with privilege comes responsibility. And so, don't just basically remember your privilege, also remember your responsibility, because in a population of 135 crore, you are among the select few that have basically gotten such, high quality education. And there is no better way of saying this than by, I'll basically use the Bhagavad Gita. This shloka comes in chapter 3, shloka 21, which goes as Yat Yat Acharati Sreshtataha Tat Tat Evetaro Janaha Sayat Pramanam Kurute Lokas Tat Anuvartate. What does that mean? Yat Yat Acharati. Acharan is basically behavior. In Hindi, Sanskrit, acharan is behavior. Yat Yat Acharati Sreshtataha. Sresht is who? Basically the privileged, people who actually are looked up to. Yat Yat Acharati Sreshtataha Tat Tat Evetaro Janaha. Janaha is basically the common people. Look up to people like you. Yat Yat Acharati Sreshtataha Tat Tat Evetaro Janaha. Sayat Pramanam Kurute. Praman is what? Proof of behavior, not just talk, just plain talk. Oh, I behave like this. No, the way you actually act, actually behave. Sayat pramanam kurute lokas tad anuvartate. People will follow that. So that is the essence of responsibility that comes with privilege as well. This and many other pieces of wisdom like this is available in the Bhagavad Gita. I would urge you all strongly to actually tap into that wisdom so that you can live life king size. Wish you all good luck.
Thank you so much. On that note, I think we've also run out of time on the call. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's a huge privilege and really humbling to have you